Okay, I think we're going to start soon, so let's gather around and. Okay, this is a panel called My Walk with Bob, and I think we've all had our walks with Bob, which have been life-changing in various ways. I've had 2 encounters with literature that have literally changed my life. I was kicked out of high school and working in a bakery, cleaning bakeries at night and taking drugs whenever I can. But one night I read Jude the Obscure, about a boy in a field reading a book and deciding he wanted to go to college. And then I applied to college. The second time was when I found Jack the Modernist, when I had first come to San Francisco. And I can actually date my intellectual life as before Bob and after Bob. So it's really a great honor to be part of this panel, even though I'm just sharing. So I'm going to read the bios of our panelists. Unfortunately, Elliot De Silva is not able to make it here this time. And we're going to change the order a little bit because Dean Smith is going to show a film he made with Bob, and we're going to begin with the film. So Dean Smith is an artist who lives and works in Oakland. He's currently represented by the Anglin Gilbert Gallery in San Francisco, and his films have screened in San Francisco Cinematheque, the 19th London Lesbian Gay Film Festival at the National Theatre London, Clark Center, Montreal, Kunstmuseum, Zurich, Artist Television Access, San Francisco, and in galleries nationally and internationally. David W. Pritchard is a poet and a scholar, but not a poet scholar. He is the author, with Kay Gabriel, of the chapbook Impropria Personae, and with Greg Purcell of More Fresh Air. Recent writing can be found in Tripwire, Crack Orgasm, the Brasilia Review, and Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. David lives in Amherst, teaches in UMass Amherst, and is currently a PhD candidate whose dissertation will be about new narrative and the reduction of space. And Conrad Steele is a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, where his research looks at ideas of influence and background noise in French and American poetry. So please give our panelists a hand. So we'll come down there.
Yeah, so we're not blocking the screen.
Alienosis, flattened out or on fire to be kissed, human beings or on fire to be kissed.
claim to be. Haunted by hybrids, I'll sleep with the dead on the wide pavement of the great Pritchard Square.
Confidentially, as if from now on I could not put a foot wrong, but coming across our baby in a foreign zoo, as I stood there decanted, events stick. Faced with so many subtitles that action scandalized his rear end, long spurts clawing the air over Bill's body. Lend your culture to an anonymous subject. Arts infested, long life learner, figure out exactly what each man wants. Unpleasant voter set to explore crater bed, hiding intimacy and lioness. He put his butthole on the ground and sat on it. Or do my nipples Lord, Dad, Mom, make up signs that D-double off or shuttle probe focuses on writing, much more focus on foreshortening. The fiction of bodies against one another to expose your vulnerability, or wait till my blouse had become quiet, or lumberjacking during sleep. Or art's beheading in the tradition of exorcism and irony. At the time of spike lingerie, the eros of 9/11. Doyler stripped down from the seawall, he leant forward on his shitting bones. Versatile orgy guy dazzled sand over his head. I gradually suffered whatever I needed for the journey into my suitcase. white man, you are white sin. You are white sin. 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 You are white sin. You are white sin. Solving the cause of nausea theater. These are dark days for aesthetes. We are too smart to place our burdens in the prow. Aesthetes now feel under siege. The heart of a hustler rests a load of pesos. He stayed in Boston, the city he came out to. In some ways it might be nice to sort of stake in. He takes the world into his mouth, a problem that swells my prick, a wriggly guilt of movement, a self-asperting 18-year-old. The stark duality that I placed myself between, heterosexual and meeting up with drama-free guys.
Say something?
I had known Bob for a little while. This was actually the first iteration of it was made back in 2004. Yeah, and so I had known Bob for a little while, and I cautiously approached him and said if he wanted to make a film together. And Bob, of course, graciously said, I'm delighted to. And I remember Bob saying that he wanted to. We made a dirty film.
Well, you're going to make the film.
Yeah, exactly. So, So the text that Bob read from is from his very long poem called I Boombox. And so he read selections, rather long selections from that, and Bob said you can take the text and cut it up at will and do anything you want to do with my voice. And so kind of gave me kind of, in certain respects, kind of carte blanche to do what it was that I wanted to do. And then, of course, as I started to edit it, showed Bob what I was doing and got feedback. And so that's the genesis of this film.
I really wanted the voice to be fucked up because the images are so degraded. I wanted the voice to be and not be kind of respectful.
It's clearly you, though. I mean, you're very recognizable.
At the same time, I wanted the text to be heard, which
Yes,
is so great,
Yeah.
because it's if you don't mind speaking about your poem, is based on Bob's misreadings of other people's texts, or things that he was reading, he would misread them. And so the play of language is so delightful. And I didn't want to fuck up the voice too much, because I wanted that beauty of that language to be heard. But at the same time, there are, segments where it's, more legible than
Okay, so is David, are you going next? Yeah, okay. Alex up here.
Should I use a mic? Can you all hear me? I have a very loud voice. If I use the mic, it's going to do all sorts of mic things. Can you hear me when I talk like this? Okay, I'm not going to use the mic then. I'm just going to sit here and do my thing. Hi, everybody. So, should I use the- all right. So, this paper distills a lot of the work I've been doing over many years in graduate school. It's cobbled or collaged together from a variety of different sources. An essay that's going to be a chapter in my dissertation, a draft of part of my prospectus, a paper I gave about Hart Crane and Bruce Boone's theory of gay subtext at the Marxist Literary Group conference at UC Davis over the summer, and some writing I did on a plane and then in a cafe somewhere near the UC Berkeley campus. I mention this to give some provisional account of the speculative and provisional character of what I'm talking about, and to account for the unevenness between different registers of discourse that might appear. I hope you, dear listener, will indulge this collage, at least weather its uneven storm, and of course, I'd love to hear what you think. The poetics and politics of new narrative, in a certain account of the sort of 70s and 80s moment, take shape in opposition to and conversation with those of the language poets working and writing on the West Coast at the same moment. Language is generally seen to be the last gasp of an historical avant-garde in North America before the total subsumption of poetry by the universities. The opposition between language and new narrative is generally understood in what little criticism on new narrative exists as one articulated along lines between, along lines between of the distinction is what I have written. I'm telling you that so I can embarrass myself and get, along the lines of the distinction between form and content, where the language poets are invested in what Robert Gluck calls the formal fireworks of an aggressively if not anti-referential poetics of the material signifier, while new narrative writers take a more representational approach. While there is some truth to this analogy, my own sense is that what is at stake is a matter not of form versus content, but of two different ideologies of form, one organized around the figure of textuality, that's language poetry, and the other, which I'll be talking about today, predicated on the figure of political commitment. By focusing on commitment, I want to bring forward what I will call new narrative's transitional imaginary in their work. The term is a light pun on Chris Nealon's textual imaginary, a nod I make to point up a more fundamental concern with the limits to a textually based hermeneutic for reading poetry. The concern is mine, but I share it with Bruce Boone and Robert Gluck. Boone, for example, observes in an essay from 1981 that the characteristic deformation, those are his words, of writing on the left in the 1970s is that, quote, it has become textual at the price of abandoning any specific political tasks, end quote. My main contention in this paper, which crystallizes a project that I will be exploring in my dissertation, is that however generative a textual approach to reading and writing poetry may be, it necessarily falls short in certain ways when questions of politics arise. Put another way, For the writers I am studying, what Nealon calls the matter of capital, those, quote, topics, topoi, and techniques that produce a textual imaginary for 20th century poetry, which it uses to stage confrontations between poetry and capital, end quote, is at one and the same time a matter of commitment. The various mediations of the unrepresentable processes of capital accumulation by poetic form encode an allegorical drama of partisan side-taking and line drawing, in which registers a whole dialectic of subjective alignment in and objective consignment to a situation. This is not to indulge in a sort of fantastical conception of poetry as a domain of untrammeled agency, or to suggest that poetry is immediate to political activity. Rather, I am concerned to point out the limits to certain overweeningly structural accounts of poetics, and literary form more generally, and political economy, and to develop a method adequate to my object of study, a method which is capable of taking new narratives concerned with consciousness into account. These terms resonate with those used by Robert Gluck in his long note on new narrative, which I think you have to at this point quote from, because everybody has quoted from that. It's great, that's not a criticism, it's just, I noticed this. After describing some of the antinomies of the language new narrative constellation, Gluck wonders, quote, why should a work of literature be organized by one pattern of engagement? Why should a position be maintained regarding the size of the gaps between units of meaning? To describe how the world is organized may be the same as organizing the world, end quote. Notice how the problem with engagement and position has to do with their too narrow application to form, rather than with the focus on form itself. You could almost say that Gluck gives form too much credit, suggesting it can itself organize the world. The spirit of this remark, however, points the way toward a reading of new narrative that foregrounds the importance of a concept of mediation in their work. I want to take all this up through a reading of Boone and Gluck's collaborative book of poems, La Fontaine, a series of translations of fables by the 17th century poet Jean de La Fontaine. The choice of object alone points up a concern with historical transition. The poets are rewriting work that scores a transition to capitalism as a way to think about a transition out of capitalism. The introduction to La Fontaine specifies and lays bare some of its committed devices, in light of the didacticism of the fable form and the use of animals in particular as fabular matter. La Fontaine, write Boone and Gluck, uses animals as so many exigent props for him to do with what he will in order to make a point. Quote, there's always this rush through the details so that he can use them, end quote. Against this, the authors tell us they've tried to put back in the details that La Fontaine glossed over. We might say that Boone and Gluck want to change the valence of use, to shift it from a verb to a noun, from use as exploitation to use as first nature. In the Marxist sense, first nature is roughly speaking like nature. And second nature is sort of the entirely social nature. The two are not opposed, but they're sort of in dialectical tension, so they mutually produce one another. But this move is not a simple matter of parallaxing La Fontaine, as the rest of the introductory paragraph makes clear. Use becomes the users, a mass market paperback which inscribes the commodity form within the project of La Fontaine from the outset, situating the poems very much within the boundaries of a society whose social synthesis is commodity exchange, in second nature, in other words. In this context, the task that Boone and Gluck set for themselves is nothing short of revolution, which they refract through an ironic appraisal of La Fontaine's reactionary politics. Quote, should he join the revolution? Why, he thinks, everything I've written has been for the revolution. They have such peasant mentalities, why don't they understand this? And so on. When La Fontaine excuses himself this way, we ought to turn our heads to spare him. We're not all Otto Rene Castillo's, Meridel Lesueur's, John Reed's, end quote. Revolution is opposed to reaction, but with a modern twist. The third term of fellow traveler is here instantiated, as the authors insist that we can't all be writers who are both for and of the revolution, distinguishing between themselves, La Fontaine, and three avant-gardists who participated in social movements in the 20th century. So, La Fontaine begins by twinning a concern with the value form with the problem of commitment. The first poem in the book, A Mutilation, Future Appealed To, opens by objectifying nature. Wow, that was a great Freudian slip. By objectifying narrative, not nature. Interesting. Opens by objectifying narrative and the act of storytelling, and rendering several qualitatively distinct devices equivalent to one another in the process. I will now do what you're not supposed to do at an academic conference and read to you from a text that I will then do a close reading of, which doesn't read out loud, it's fine. Quote, this is from A Mutilation. Now here's one I like, or stop me if you've heard this, but this story is the exception. It's vouched for by science and actually happened. You judge, end quote. I feel Bob Gluck is in the audience. I'm now going to read his poem at him, I'm sorry. In these 5 lines, the poets begin to tell a story 3 times. The first 2 beginnings are something like false starts, which Boone and Gluck oppose to the actual introduction of the story they plan to tell that actually happened. These false starts appear in quotation marks, suggesting that they do not originate with the speakers. Indeed, these phrases strike us as typical rather than a poetic innovation, and their presence here as quotes invites us to read them as figures for the typical. They exemplify what Valentin Voloshinov calls reported speech. Speech with, quote, this is Voloshinov, quote, speech within speech, utterance within utterance, and at the same time speech about speech, utterance about utterance, end quote. This reportage is complicated by the fact that what is being reported already constitutes a kind of reported speech. So the poets are reporting that reportage in a way that invokes a whole history of stories being told, as well as a whole possible future full of storytelling. The final sentence solicits intervention from the reader, who must gauge whether the authentication by way of an appeal to science passes muster. At the same time, however, in the context of the heightened artifice of this paragraph with its foregrounding of the operation of storytelling itself, you judge takes on another valence, linking up with the typicality that undergirds this passage and thus serving to describe the general function of the audience as opposed to storytelling. It is a claim about and in the present, a referendum on the ongoing process of judgment that happens as one reads. In short, one reading judges. This proliferation of narrative tropes does not so much tell a story as represent the activity of storytelling, whose gestures take the place of any description happening within a narrative elaboration itself. In other words, narrative is here abstracted and objectified, we might say commodified, and sundered from the material to which it could possibly refer. Narrative is in the domain of second nature. It is thoroughly social and confesses as much to the reader. This kind of against the arguments against narrative that one finds in some more like canonical like things from like Language magazine or whatever. You fill in the blank of the thing against narrative that is canonical to you. This is the opposite of that. From here, Boone and Gluck move into a story about first nature, doing so under the sign of the commodity form's other, commitment, which, as their introduction shows, is sutured to the former by the utopian activity of judgment. Political decisions are determined by, inextricable from, consumer choices. The injunction that the reader make a political decision, you judge, is homologous to that made by ideology, you consume. I'll spare you the agonies of trying to follow any more out loud close reading. Suffice it to say that the next major figure in A Mutilation is that of dissection, which leads Boone and Gluck and their judging reader to discover an abstraction at the heart of first nature. The owl in the poem has freed the mice from nature, only to cripple them so that they cannot escape. The tree the captive mice are held in is cut down on account of age, as if to suggest that the processes of primitive accumulation, the freeing of labor from the land and from its means of subsistence that Marx analyzes in the closing chapters of Volume 1 of Capital, these processes persist into the moment of late or multinational capitalism. The violence through which capitalism reproduces itself underwrites each and every real abstraction. In this context, the choice to oppose commodities, which I hardly need insist again is predicated on the social synthesis of commodity exchange itself, is not a fantasy about being outside of the totality of capitalist social relations so much as a strategic window onto the unrepresentable, because equally total, project of a revolutionary negation of those relationships. I have dwelt at some length on one poem in La Fontaine. The first one, no less. Suffice it to say that this whole book warrants a more thorough treatment than I can give it in a conference paper. All of its poems return us to the interrelation of commitment and commodity, using animal metaphors to facilitate speculation about the problem of reproduction that resides at the heart of capitalist crisis. For Boone and Gluck, the problem seems to constellate around the various processes of primitive accumulation in a way that anticipates the elaborate theorization of accumulation by dispossession that David Harvey will undertake in his work on the new imperialism in the 1990s and 2000s. And as an aside, I would say that Boone and Gluck anticipate the critique of Harvey as well, since poems like Pig, Goat, Sheep, and The Rat and the Oyster formally argue, since, as those poems formally argue, primitive accumulation's persistence by no means entails the outmoding of surplus value extraction at the point of production as the primary means of capitalist accumulation. Into these structural concerns, Boone and Gluck enthusiastically reintroduce the question of the revolutionary subject in a way that we can read alongside Fanon's theorization of revolutionary violence as a kind of absolute praxis or a perfect mediation, and the building of the sort of liberated nation, or Guy Hoppenheim's account of the desire to desire and capitalism's axial paranoia and resultant homophobia. Both of these names, Fanon and Hoppenheim, index readings of other poems from La Fontaine that I've cut from this paper for time's sake. It's not a positive or empirical elaboration of this radical subject, but a utopian one. The subject here occupies the space, the no place, between a world of commodities and the impossible necessity of choosing to negate that world. And in a final twist, it is not the poets, but the readers who are asked to take this up, you judge, and carry it forward in the name of an unalienated future. I think that the rest of this is just notes, so that's where I'm going to end, with unalienated future.
Can you hear me okay at the back like this? Yeah, so borderline. Can everybody hear him? Yeah, I think okay.
So, my paper is called Our Own Present Tense, Robert Gluck, Random Brown, and the New Narrative at Present. And obviously I'd like to say that it's a huge privilege to read it like in the presence of both of those people. That's what How hard can it be to talk about the present? I want to start with an example from towards the end of Marjorie Kemp, Robert Gluck's novel. Gluck is describing Earl, his lover, and he writes, "When he speaks, it's not about us, but about current events, updates, the kind of petty news heads of families Xerox and send at Christmas. I listen in disbelief. My aging and death could not go forward without his consent." It's a couple of beautiful sentences in a novel that's full of them. Absolutely lucid, but also so elusive and withheld. My aging and death could not go forward without his consent. It suggests the approximate sentiment of, I can't live without him, or I live or die at his command. But of course it's actually a much more complicated construction, emotionally and grammatically. That modal verb could has a strange mixture of uses, and here, although it seems clear that it's being used to express a hypothetical of some sort, there's still a couple of different ways that you could read this sentence. My aging and death could not go forward without his consent. Could be, I need this, I need his consent, without which my aging and death, which is to say my life, could not go forward. Or it could be, I can't believe this, my aging and death could not go forward without his consent, but he's given it anyway, this could have been stopped. Either way, it's an awful, lacerating moment of self-delusion. But in one version, it's self-deluding about the future, as in, if I lose this love, aging itself will stop. Whereas in the other version, it's self-deluding looking backwards. If I had not lost this love, aging would now be stopped. And then maybe actually we should add a third possibility, because could, although it often expresses possibility in the present, is also the past tense of can. So Gluck's phrase could simply be an indicative statement about the past. He refused his consent. My aging and death could not go forward. Now, I know all of this seems a little pedantic, but these are three distinct ways that you can pass this sentence. And the reason I think it's worth commenting on is because it hopefully starts to open out a broader question of what tenses, and the present tense in particular, might mean in Gluck's writing. This is a raw issue in Marjorie Kemp especially. In case anyone doesn't know it, the whole narrative is built on a kind of fault line between tenses. It tells the story of the breakdown of Gluck's relationship with Earl, But it also tells the story of Marjorie Kemp, who was a 15th century Christian mystic who wrote probably the first autobiography in English. As Gluck puts it, I performed my story by lip-syncing Marjorie's loud longing. And the way it's constructed is that the sections that tell Marjorie's story are in the past tense, whereas the sections describing his own experience are in what's called the historic present. For instance, I need Earl to be mine. I call Tom, I call Kathy, I call my old friend Ed. These events are obviously not contemporaneous with the time of writing, but grammatically speaking, they are in the present. The historical present is a common grammatical usage, but it invites a complex range of responses, from a kind of illusionistic immersion in the time of the narrative, to a more dry, abstract removal, as if you were reading a history book. Or then again, it could be what Jonathan Culler has recently talked about as the lyric present. The fundamental characteristic of the lyric, according to Culler, is not the description and interpretation of a past event, but the iterative and iterable performance of an event in the lyric present, the special now of lyric articulation. I'm not too sure about this special now, but the point I'm trying to make is simply that what we call the present tense actually covers a hugely complex array of possible connections between time and language and presence. And that when we're thinking about Robert Gluck now and new narrative now, we need to respond to the specific grammar of presence and the present that we find in Gluck's writing. What got me thinking about this in terms of grammar and tense is that last year, Brandon Brown, a younger poet also from the Bay Area, wrote a wonderful essay in appreciation of Robert Gluck in the Poetry Project newsletter. I'd just like to read the last couple of sentences of Brown's essay. His books, this is about Gluck obviously, his books and his friendship help us find our own present tense, wherever and whenever that is. Once we're there, everything tastes better, more vivid, a peach over a sink. Our studies, our findings, our vengeances, our convictions, our then, our now, our future. So the argument that I think Brown is engaging with here is that you might hypothetically read Gluck and be like, well, it's great, but it's so much of its particular time and its place within a certain group of friends. It's just an artifact of San Francisco in the 80s and the 90s. This would be the kind of narrow-minded dismissal of much new narrative writing that Brown's essay so compellingly makes the case against, by saying that yes, of course, Gluck's writing is of its time and place, and that is precisely why it is so great in making us, its readers, more open and sensitive to the excitations of our own times and places. His books and his friendship help us find our own present tense. So, like I say, it's a wonderful piece of celebratory criticism, but it's also quite complicated, this way of putting it. There's a paradox to the idea of finding our own present tense that's doing a lot of work here. Because the thing about the present tense is that within a given language, everyone obviously uses the same one. You don't have to, you don't have, or we don't have our own present tense. It's a given. It's what grammaticians call deictic, in the sense that its reference, the reference of the present tense, is determined in relation to this moment of utterance, whenever or in whomever's mouth this happens to be. So Brown's metaphor of our own present tense, which actually builds on a couple of things that Gluck says in his own criticism, you could say it turns on its own redundancy, pulling that concept of an us, a we, out of nowhere. It insists on rediscovering what's already present and sharing what's already shared. To put it another way, it turns a fixed temporal relation into a personal one. The grammar of time and the grammar of persons are normally fairly distinct, but Brown's idea of our own present tense makes as if each is in some way present in the other. In Brown's essay, this overloading of the idea of the present tense is an apt symbol for the enduring closeness or intimacy or nowness of Gluck's writing. But I think it's also a real insight into his technique. Because what I started to notice was that in Gluck's prose, tenses do get overloaded, and that these neutral grammatical structures do become invested, I want to say over-invested, with various intensities of meaning and feeling. Marjorie Kemp is the key example I want to talk about today, but you could also quote Jack the Modernist, near the end, after narrating most of his affair with Jack in the past tense, there's this switch, a direct address first in the future and then in the present. Jack, I am going to lose you and myself and our future. A portion of that loss already forms part of my present. That future may now have become the present, and that present in 1985 or whenever may now have become the past. But the configuration of tenses sort of ties an emotional knot that remains intractable over time. Or, to switch metaphors, it's like a knot in a tree trunk that remains ingrained even after the branch may have been overgrown or cut off. I'm partly following Rob Halpern here, who says in one of his articles that much new narrative writing, quote, suggests the temporality of a future anterior. What new form of community will have emerged here? A tense that will only map onto the present by exposing its inconsistencies, its errors and openings, end quote. Now, Halpern's not actually talking about the literal handling of tenses in new narrative writing. Like Brown, he's using tense as a metaphor. But what's interesting is that what makes tense available as a metaphor in the first place for Halpern is that it's not just a way of specifying a relation between events in time. A grammatical tense also offers a way of looking at the world. So when Gluck writes, I am going to lose you, and a portion of that loss already forms part of my present, he expresses an emotional situation that could be formulated as the feeling of a future anterior. As per Halpern's remark, Gluck could have written, I am going to have lost you. There's an acute feeling of being caught in the temporal coils of a particular moment, but the expression of that feeling is itself set free or set adrift from that moment. So I guess it's probably quite uncontroversial to suggest that an important part of what new narrative means at present is closely linked to this sense of speaking unapologetically from within a particular social and historical moment, indeed from within a particular social and historical self, without seeing this as a constraint or limitation on the legibility of what's written. You could invoke Ezra Pound's famous thing about poetry being news that stays news, and it is apposite up to a point. The so-called new narrative might be resistant to definition, but it does live up to its name. It stays new. But of course, what Gluck writes has never been as straightforward as just news. Going back to the sentences from Marjorie Kemp that I started with, remember that Gluck's description of the way Earl talked was, it's not about us, but about current events, updates, the kind of petty news heads of families Xerox and send round at Christmas. This would be the kind of news that conspicuously doesn't stay new, and it's not about us. That's the word. The story as Gluck tells it, by comparison, is about us, but us isn't some kind of interpersonal news cycle. If you think about the discourse of the news, there's this phase metonymy, where the retelling of events in the media, the news story, is received as an extension or manifestation of those events. Like Gluck says, what you get from the news is a series of updates, the kind of news heads of families Xerox, as if a newspaper was a Xerox of history. You could say that in its purest form, news of this kind has no tense. It's just a series of noun phrases, like a headline, famous author in transhistorical heartbreak, or whatever. By contrast, in Marjorie Kemp, the writing is so often mixed up with the is often so mixed up with the temporality of the events described that you could feel the reference shifting from the end of one sentence to the start of the next. Just to give one example, again from Marjorie Kemp. I make 2 wishes, to be Elle's mother and to have the freedom to reign. I wait for a moment for the wishes to come true. At the end of the moment, I am older and so separate from others that I feel mutilated. Obviously, it's just an illusion that the moment Gluck waits and the moment the reader waits are the same moment. In reality, Gluck waited, the reader waits. But the effect of the historic present tense is to muddy these distinctions. The absolute passage of time is subordinated to the relative structures that Gluck's grammar draws momentarily within it. It's not that it stays new, it's not that it stays new so much as that it's new each time. If this is writing that helps us find our own present tense, The part of this is it makes us aware of just how provisional and ambiguous that notion of the present within the present tense might be. In his collection Top 40, Brandon Brown is thinking about the song Love Somebody by Maroon 5, and he writes, "I admit, however, that it is hard to imagine a future in which this song comes on and I do anything other than shudder and skip." But then he continues, "But I don't know, you can't tell the future finally." And then a little later, because we cannot tell the future, it's all the more difficult to tell the present, despite the efforts of America's Top 40, the Stock Exchange, all avant-gardes. It's a really clever use of the word tell, which can mean either perceive, like telling the future or telling the difference, or communicate, like telling a story or telling the truth. Is the difficulty of telling the present one of perception or communication? The Top 40, like the news, perhaps makes it seem like the former, like the present is just a matter of information, of keeping up to date. As Brown puts it, America's Top 40 attempts to draw a matrix of collective attention in the present. Its definition of the present is the week. This week's 40 songs are offered up as a kind of metonym for this week, for America's present. And Brown's collection, with 40 sentences on each of the 40 songs in the chart one week in 2013, sort of plays at extending this logic with its own matrix-like structure. But it also plays on the limitations of this logic, creating a 40 by 40 grid playfully frozen in time. Its own matrix of attention is wholly specific to Brown's life and the locality of his writing. Any constructed sense of a wider present moment slips away through the gaps in that grid. And I think this goes back to the question that I started with. How hard can it be to talk about the present? In Long Note on New Narrative, Gluck describes the present as the one thing impossible to put into words, because language does not yet exist to describe it. But in his essay about Gluck, Brown counters that the greatness of Gluck's writing refuses the usual sentence on the contemporary, that it cannot be uttered. Maybe this is true, that somehow Gluck succeeds where others fail, that his language comes closer to whatever moving surface of time we understand as the present. But what I think is more important is how his present tense hovers on the edge of this difficulty, impossible to pin down between the shifting channels of writing, reading, and experience. And maybe this is why looking back at New Narrative now hardly feels like looking back at all. It's almost more like looking into a mirror. In Top 40, Brown has a great bit about mirrors, just to conclude on. He's talking about Mirrors, the song by Justin Timberlake, but what he says is it feels too creepy to take Mirrors literally. So I've started thinking about it not as a love song for Jessica Biel, inspired by Timberlake's parents, but rather as a song addressed to pop music itself. Pop, then, is the mutable reflective surface which both changes which both changes and is changed by whoever gazes into it, end quote. When you look at it like that, the present tense is itself mirror-like. Whoever speaks it at whatever time, it always in appearance reflects back the exact point we're looking at. But Gluck's present tense isn't just a matter of being up-to-date, shifting to the reflection of our own time. It pulls our time towards it. As Gluck writes in the essay My Community, any art wants to take the place of your reflection in the mirror and call for your recognition. It makes you become it like a magic spell with words, images, representations. It is at this starting point that an art movement or a political movement has moral life.
Before we open up the questions to the audience, I'd just like to say that I'm incredibly grateful to these young scholars for taking Bob Gluck's work so seriously, and also for committed to certain kinds of methodologies that have been falling out of favor. I love close reading, and I think that's a wonderful practice. And to go back to La Fontaine is really a wonderful thing to do. And I, as you probably gathered from yesterday, I really love philology and grammar. And I think that that kind of reading is just absolutely terrific. You know, the 11th century Indian philosopher Bhartrhari said that grammar is the royal road to salvation. And I words to live by. But anyways, I'm really grateful for this, and also to Dean Smith for sharing his wonderful update to this beautiful film I had originally seen when it first came out. So, but I'd like to open up, because conversation in progress is the best thing ever. So please talk.
I was wondering about, like thinking about the title of the panel, like who is the we that walks with Bob, you know? Like, and part of it was coming out of your paper, Conrad, about the different hours that get reflected. And I was thinking about how in Brandon's book, the reflection on the top 40 becomes a reflection on how like white American pop culture is deeply indebted to African American music. And even in Marjorie Kemp, Bob sources a lot of the language of sexual experience that Marjorie, that's in Marjorie's voice from other people because of like a feeling of a lack of access to like this experience. So yeah, I guess I think that's a question for David as well. But like what is the collective that these works invite? Like I think obviously in reading Bob we like become we walk with him, but I'm just wondering about like where the boundaries of that collectivity might be.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. One of the things I was thinking about a lot was the way that with any language, grammar functions as a shorthand for all kinds of things, including imaginations of community. When you say we, it's a shorthand for a community, and because it's a shorthand, you're never quite sure simply by that grammatical structure who that includes or doesn't include. It can be further specified, but it's also kind of ephemeral. And I think that does sort of connect to the kind of feeling of community that I get from reading Gluck and other narrative writing as well, where there's the structures of community coexist in a kind of quite provisional way with real attention to the problems of who it includes and doesn't include. I think that there's a grammatical term, you can talk about a shifter, extend the grammatical thing even further, where a particular linguistic reference can refer to different people or different groups depending on the content in which it's spoken. And I feel that that idea of the shifter is kind of, it would be like a nice grammatical emblem for, at least for Marjorie Kemp. Certainly the thing you mentioned of the contributions that come from different friends and other writers talking about their own bodies which are brought into the novel. It's a fantastic idea, and it transforms your experience of reading it, because you're always wondering, where does this come from, where does this come from, and you never know. You don't know when Gluck is using X's or Y's description. So I think the question that you raised about who is we is one that is always very much raised and is not resolved.
I mean, I think I disagree about in terms of because you said that when you're reading it, the sort of experience of reading collages that you're always wondering where stuff came from. And I actually think one of the things that's really exciting about, and I mean Marjorie Kemp, also Jack the Modernist, any number of things, is that it feels like a sort of use of collage that avoids that. I mean, David Anton has this talk where he says that there's a particular kind of collage that's the same as going to Sears, because it's like you have all of the different things that you could possibly want, and you just have to sort of find the place in Sears where it is. And so the collage is like, it is kind of narrowed to a really, and I'm not saying that you said that necessarily, but I think that what's interesting is that the sort of knowing about the collage, and I mean, all right, this is maybe polemical, it kind of brings to mind, in a way that is as in keeping with this sort of shifting sense of the present, it almost reminds me of, like, forgive me, how Wordsworth talks about what a lyric poet is. I mean, it's a gay version, because when you say, if you said that Bob Gluck was a man speaking to men in the language, I mean, like, these might slightly mean different things than Wordsworth. He's not teaching you to be good bourgeois subjects. This is sort of O'Hara version of that. But I think that kind of negative image, because Wordsworth is not really clear about who the people he's speaking to are. It's just a sort of, I mean, it's an abstraction, right? It's the populations that are moving towards cities in England. And I think that the sort of sense of community being a kind of useful negative abstraction is kind of nice, because if you start making a list of who's in that community, which I don't think that's what the sort of sourcing of language does, but if you start making a list, it soon becomes clear that there is no community anymore. Because the whole point is that to posit some kind of unity or solidarity or whatever you want to call it is a kind of utopian gesture insofar as it doesn't empirically cohere. And I think that, like, the sort of tension between the impossibility of, like, an empirical community and then the utopian desire for something that has to kind of exist in the negative is where I would put the we. Because I think that when we say we all desire a kind of community that doesn't, like, sort of exist as such. Does that make sense? Is this answering your question? I think we agree, but also, like, we get there through completely divergent passages, which is also a we. Yeah.
When Gluck is quoting Marjorie Kemp, it's very important to know that that was Marjorie Kemp's thing that she would have said had she had that book period. Because remember, while she's walking around Europe and fantasizing sex with Jesus, she's also paying very close attention to the trial of Joan of Arc. You know, so and talk about no community. So quotation matters. I think quotation really matters. So, but I shouldn't be talking. This is not my job.
Conrad, I want to thank you for a really rich structural analysis of Bob's book, Marjorie Kemp, which is a book that I think a lot of people in this room really treasure. I was wondering, because you did talk about temporality in the terms of sentence structure in the book, if you might have more comments on, and you did have some, but if you might have more thoughts on content in the book, which actually mirrors a lot of these questions of what Aaron Shern calls the simultaneity of times, in that, like, you're talking about two love stories, unfulfilled love stories in certain ways, or love stories that disintegrate, that oscillate, and that have these overlapping points, but also have two distinct voices. And I'm wondering if, outside of, like, the structural analysis, which you did an excellent job on, if you might talk about where that content comes in as well, and, like, informs your reading.
That was so having the like quoted all this stuff in front of people who wrote it and I'm going to misquote it.
I wouldn't remember.
Probably other people might know this as well. There's a great bit somewhere in the middle of the book where Gluck describes the structure. Well, I think what I want to say in response to that is that I feel like this, out of all books, somehow its structure is its content. And Gluck describes its structure as being two halves that can never add up to a whole. And I think he then revises it and says that there's the old stuff and the new stuff, and then there's this empty space that can't be filled, which I think is a phrase that comes from the French. So thinking about, one of the things I feel uncomfortable about in the paper is, of course, that it feels like it's circling around sort of what Marjorie Kemp is really about, but I think that that's also what the novel does. It feels like if it has a content or a centre that's somehow outside text, and I know that I think another important, very brief moment in it is where Gluck describes it as a book about his breakdown, but that he, I think, explicitly refers to as happening elsewhere and being latent in the kind of very odd textual relations between the different fragments that he works with. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question or a kind of way of trying to avoid answering it.
No, thank you.
Those are in the back.
I have a question for Conrad. And it's a question about genre. So your presentation is sort of sutured together by poetry in a lot of ways. You've got poetry as news that stays news, Jonathan Culler and the iterative temporality of lyric. And I think one of the provocative implications of your reading of Marjorie's account via Brandon Brown is that the sort of hermeneutic adequate to reading the book is lyric, or its modernist after images. And so I wondered if you could maybe tease out some broader conclusions about the relationship of new narrative writing to poetry.
Yeah, I wanted to and didn't also talk about Reader, books collections, and it's as I understand it, this is a collection of poetry about reading poetry, much of which ends up being in prose, and there's this sense of kind of infinite regresses going both ways of poets thinking about prose and vice versa. Likewise, Top 40 and other works of Brahms that I've read, the Persians would be another example, plays with translating between ideas of prose and poetry. I feel that probably more important than any kind of theorization of the lyric, like Culler tries to provide, is a kind of sociology maybe of what feelings are activated by these forms and by playing around the edges of them as both of these do. Top 40 looks like poetry because it's divided into sentences, but it also kind of repurposes that line break structure into something that is more like, that kind of feels like a bit of a play on the feeling of commodity, the feeling of grids, which I would understand to be in some kind of tension with the possibilities of feeling evoked by the idea of the fragments of language that lyric traditionally is constituted out of. So what I'm trying to say is that I feel like both of these texts have obviously thought a lot about this distinction between poetry and prose, possibly have come to the conclusion that the distinction has no important innate meaning, I would say, but jump back and forth over the border very agile.
Questions?
Okay. Excuse me. And actually, a question for you, Dean. But it's coming from the question of the mirror and a reported speech. And in the film, we have a first-person Bob. But I found the success of the film for me was that I felt that the imagery was not a reflection of the text, but was more directed at the viewer, a mirror for the viewer. And I just wonder if that question makes sense for you when you were putting it together, how you were thinking about that imagery with respect to the viewer and to Bob's.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't interested in making an illustrational film or trying to have the imagery directly be synced up with the text. I mean, at certain points, there are images that kind of link up, but in a more tangential way. So I think that like the imagery, hopefully, if I'm correct, kind of more metaphorical, like in the segment, I cast my net in attention going across the bridge, the structure of the bridge being net-like and being drawn into this kind of web of brief flashes of images, which is about a state of inattention, where you're not able to really focus on something for very long, the way that the kind of strobe effect. So that would be an example, I think, of like how the text and the image kind of play off of each other. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah, just to kind of comment on that, I think that I mean that it's, you know, it's like not, it's like I mean, it's pretty like obvious in this way, but like the, you know, straight white, you know, men, you are my bitches, and then this kind of, you know, like raggedy old glory, you know, like that's another example of what you're speaking towards, and like really potent in this way that I really enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, I you know, Bob's work is so full of humor and also politics, and so I'm trying in a way. The film is not very humorful, except for that probably that one segment. But then also trying to draw in the kind of level of politics, and again with the tattered flag, the spinning kind of distorted cross in two-part paranoia. So kind of trying to tease that out a little bit without being hopefully super obvious. You know?
Sorry, I also have a comment. Like, it's interesting, and I think that this kind of is a thread that links all three of our sort of things. It's like, I mean, when I watched it, what I thought of was sort of a lot of the 1920s like surrealist films. So Chien Andalou, but also what is it called? The Leger one, Ballet Mécanique. Is that it? Okay.
Yeah.
Because I thought that like part of it was that, and you know, Un Chien Andalou is, I think, a lot more kind of directly symbolic, and it's drawing on a lot of religious imagery. But I thought that part of what you were sort of doing was trying to set up the tension between, on the one hand, the kind of state of distraction that you were just describing, and then both using the language, which is where your film differs from both of these older films, using the language and then the sort of intertitles as a way to like make distraction the precondition for, like, I don't know, Andre Breton would call it convulsive beauty or whatever. But the whole point was that you were setting up these two halves that don't add up into a whole thing, and the whole point was that kind of constant negotiation was supposed to, and I mean, in surrealism, it's this like weird Freudian romanticism where it's like, and then everything is connected on the grid of desire, which is sort of a nice idea. But I think that kind of juxtaposition really mirrors the way that the way that you described how Marjorie Campus kind of is too uneven. Which is my answer to this question about genre, which is I think that it's kind of nice, or it can be helpful, and this is also kind of riffing on something that like Halpern has said in writing. It is maybe a strong reading of Halpern, I'm not sure, but like using the sort of 1920s-ish like Benjamin and surrealist kind of theorizations that variously like kind of constellate around your narrative to think about how like it's not so much the sort of choice of having to choose between genres when it's like, well, this is a poem and this is prose or whatever, but it's like using these things in ways that are supposed to change in some fundamental way what the genre is doing. So like, Andre Breton, would you say that Nadia is a novel? I don't really know. In the content, he's like, I hate Dostoevsky and realism. It's stupid and you describe stuff. This book is different, but it's kind of a novel. I mean, in a lot of sort of generic ways, it is predicated on realism. And so I think like that kind of negativity about genre might be a way to think about that. Sorry, I answered your question, but I was thinking about it while you were
I think we have time for one more. So, oh, he's mimicking, he's miming applause. So,